Welcome back after coffee. Now we have our distinguished Italian visitor, Ada Segre, to talk to us. Ada reminded me that she entered this world through a course at West Dean that I was running in 1986, so that's a bit ago. And also she was examined in her thesis by David Jakes, shows that she was very much part of the home team. And that thesis was indeed on 17th century planting. So Ada has been considering this subject for quite a period and is going to give us the benefits of her thoughts and research. Ada.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, David and Jan, and thank you all. I'm very, very happy to be here in England. And it's very funny because it's what I'm going to show you is a bit the application of what I had the opportunity of studying during my PhD at York. So it's really a sort of English knowledge or know-how going back to Italy and coming back to England in some ways. So it's a funny how can I say, in a way, a love story between between Italy and England. I'm not going to talk so much about theory because I would have thought that in a conference called Getting It Right, the practical sides of intervention would be more interesting to you. So what I'm going to talk about are two restoration plans that were actually carried out in Italy and that I was involved with and gave me the, how can I say, the chance of trying out whatever conclusions I had from my thesis onto the ground. Dangerous thing. And, well, I think I'll be honest about the error, the mistakes, and also things that were confirmed. So I'll start with the restoration of part of the southern garden in Genoa. It's called the Palazzo del Principe, the Prince's Palace, and it belongs still up to today to the Doria Pamphili family. That is privately owned, although they have a company called Arti Doria, which really represents the family. So this is a private commission, which makes it's quite different from a public one, which will be illustrated in the second case study, that is the restoration of the secret gardens at the Villa Borghese in Rome, which some of you have seen with me when you undertook your Italian trip. Right, let's start with the first slide. Just a few background information on the location of the garden. There it is, in a mid-16th century Lafrari map of the town of Genoa. You can see it stands on the western side of the city, at the center of the bay, basically at the center of the port. This is the old pier, the important port, where all the warships entered and anchored. And this is the private pier, or direct access through the sea to the garden and to the palace. Perhaps you should know this belonged to Andrea Doria, very famous soldier, and then sea captain, and then basically one of the ruler of Genoa when the Republic, the Maritime Republic of Genoa, was founded. So the garden was started around 1529 by Andrea Doria, who died in 1560, and then it was continued by his nephew and heir, Giovanni Andrea Doria. We regard the from 1560 to 1605, we regard the period 1529 as until 1605 as the so-called Renaissance garden, for the purpose of explaining we'll relate to it as one thing, although they weren't exactly the same. We know that Andrea Doria started up with the earthworks. He enjoyed the help of slaves that were given to him by the King of Spain, and so all the terracing and all the structure was carried out by Andrea Doria. This is the garden, how it looked at the end of the 19th century.
I think this microphone's a little too close to you.
Okay, is it all right now?
Yes, you're booming it, you see.
Is it okay? Can you hear me? It's better. Right. This is a late 19th century picture of the garden, which I brought to you because the garden is still there, the structure in its entirety. At the end of the 19th century, part of the northern garden, which is behind the palace, and ends up here in this niche with a colossal statue of Jupiter, and this is the colossal statue of Neptune, depicted with Andrea Doria's traits. So it's basically Neptune, Andrea Doria as Neptune, coming out of the sea, conquering the land. So he's already conquered the sea, he's conquered the land, and he's looking up. Really, they sort of were face to face with an eye link at Jupiter. And also the iconography of the frescoes in the palace is varies on this motif of sea and earth. So this is very important because this is the idea of this whole garden. Next one. Now, this is an early 19th century diagram, a plan. It's not very precise, but it will give you an idea of the structure of the garden. This is the palace. This is the sea. This is the southern garden. This is the loggia, magnificent loggia with a two-story loggia with an entrance directly from the private pier of Andrea Doria's private pier. And this is the northern garden with a huge pergola and 7 terraces. All this part is now destroyed, and you access the northern garden through a bridge that connected the terrace from the Piano Nobile. So there is a street underneath here. Now this was confiscated by the town in order to build the rail line. So instead of the pergola, we've got the rail line that connects Genoa to anywhere else in Italy. Some of this terracing is still visible if you've got a trained eye. A huge art and crafts, a Liberty hotel was built over here, and only a grotto, magnificent grotto, remains that was bought back again and restored by the family. This whole area is practically lost to the garden. Let's go on. Now this is perhaps one of the few early images, as mid-16th century, famous Jan Mass's picture of Genoa as Flora, and this is the palace, and this is the northern garden. So this is basically still the Andrea Doria, the early Renaissance garden. Now, before we go to this 17th century image, I'd like to show you the only plan we've got by this German architect called Schickhardt, who traveled on his grand tour at the end of the 16th century with the Duke of Württemberg, and he drew sketches. So we know that in 1599 they were planning to have the Neptune fountain put in, but it wasn't there, and we had the 4-season fountains already in place, and the upper terrace was already finished. Let's go on. This is a late, is it in focus? This is a late 18th century image. Now, what is important to remind, we have the first Renaissance garden, of which we know very little, really very little indeed. We have very little visual material. We have found no maps and no plans. Then we know that in 1726 there was this transformation in the French style. And this is a 1726 map that shows, and this is really very interesting because you can see how an Italian garden is transformed into a so-called French garden. You can see that the squares, the compartimenti, they are transformed into rectangles. This is one of the shifts that we've got from the preference of square shapes or square compartments into elongated rectangular shapes. And this is done by putting an additional fountain at the center so that this becomes the center of this composition. So basically they are sort of using the former garden and transforming it. Same here, of course, all these rounded edges belong to the French 18th century, and the footpaths were enlarged. Okay? So this is important. All we've got, and we've got quite a lot of information on the 18th century layout. And it, for example, this is a proposal for a parterre de broderie designed by Robert Delacote, probably a member of the Delacote family of gardeners that worked at Versailles. We don't know, we're not sure, but he worked in Genoa for many years. And this is another, basically this is a survey. So there was, at some point, there were a couple of parterres de broderie, as you can see. This is really, really late 18th century. You must bear in mind that some fashions arrived to Italy quite late. So when everybody else was already planting and doing English landscape gardens, in Italy they were still dealing with the transformation into French gardens. In some places it's not a uniform situation. And we've got finally an attempt. I'm sorry the maps are not so good, the reproduction here. An attempt when one of the Doria married a Talbot, an English woman. She wanted an English garden, and this was the plan that was produced in England. But this was the plan that was actually carried out in Genoa. So a mixture, a mixed form of a romantic, picturesque garden, leaving the central formal core. Not very successful, and it never picked up, really. When I was, and this is how it looked like before the transformation. So you have the feeling of how it looked like. And this is the famous loggia, a very important feature. Most of it is now destroyed because they built a motorway, an elevated motorway and a high-speed way. So you've got two fast roads on top of each other, just cutting in the middle of the loggia. Now, this is the situation in October 1997 when I was force called by the family to see the garden, and there was an outdoor cinema, as you can see, and it was very difficult to know what there was, because it was actually very difficult to walk the garden. And this is the view from the other side, from the loggia. But it was made very clear to me from the start, from the family, and the young couple of the princess and her husband were very, very active in defining what they wanted, and throughout all the restoration, they said, we want Andrea and Giovanna Andrea's garden because the palace is a Renaissance palace. That's the most important period. And in a way, this resembles a bit the story of Hampton Court with the youth. I mean, there was a very strong will that decided what they wanted. And one could argue, and there was criticism, because basically this meant destroying the so-called English garden, but nothing of the French garden was left. So basically destroying the last layer. So the first stage was to clear up and see what it got. So the first thing we did was a tree survey. We had VTA, visual tree assessment, with someone coming in and saying, this must be felled, it's dangerous, this must not be felled because it's not dangerous. And it turned out that some trees that were supposed to be dangerous were perfectly healthy, and others that were supposed to be specimen not to be felled actually broke after some gale. Wind broke main branches. Anyway, the strong will of the princess and her husband, who is the administrator, an art historian, and really the soul of all this, was to open up the garden to the sea. No matter, regardless of the fact that you had 2 high-speed roads and buildings, they said it doesn't matter. The character of this garden was to be overlooking on the sea. I was really a bit doubtful, but in the end I think they were right. Now, archaeology. Archaeology started up because I thought, well, because I'd been in England and I had heard about archaeology, I'd seen archaeology in English gardens, and I said we must undertake archaeology, we must know at least what the size of footpaths were and the problem was that this palace and gardens had been heavily bombed during the Second World War, really consistently bombed. So what we did, we managed to get photographs just after the bombing and spot the exact location of where the bombs fell and where the ground might be untouched. And for example, as you can see here, this ramp, which enables to get access from the upper terrace to the lower terrace, was bombed on the western side. And this is the reconstruction of the pebble mosaic called riso that they make in Genoa. It's late, it's 19th century. We found a date, but still it was thought it was worth to reconstruct it. And here are the four, one of the fountains of the seasons. There were 4, and I must show you the exact location of that. Right, this is already the restoration plan, but here you have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I was asked to produce the plan for the whole of the southern garden. However, the restoration that was undertaken only involved the central part, because the eastern part is rented out to a company that doesn't want to return it, and it will take about 10 to 15 years to get it back. Then the western part will be restored at in a second phase. And then we've got this more western part. It is the aviary. Very famous aviary indeed. All the travelers wrote about it. And John Evelyn, in his chapter on aviaries, in his Elysium Britannicum, writes that after having visited Genoa, that not everybody can afford such a large and incredible aviary as the Prince Doria in Genoa has, with trees, and was covered with a metal mesh, trees of all sorts, etc., etc. Now, this is being excavated, and they've found amazing things. So, now let's go on with the slides, because I think this is the interesting bit that's coming along. This is one of the season statues that is temporarily stored in one of the lodges, but will be put back eventually. This is, well, this is important because you make a survey of all existing maps, and then you dig and you find something that has never been recorded, like these two water tanks, which are in this position. We even found them after this map was drawn. Very deep indeed. And we don't know what they were used for, and just unexpected. And fantastic tubes. This is a female one for high pressure water feeding the fountains. They put up a museum. I know you don't get excited seeing that, but I did when we found this, because these are remnants of water canals watering the wall bed, and this was reconstructed like this, you see? Okay. Now, this is part of the excavation at the aviary around here. Now, I think from the methodological point of view, this is the interesting bit, because they wanted this 16th, 17th century garden. We didn't have a clue how it looked like. We didn't have enough visual material nor documents, in spite of the fact that we scanned all known researches and worked at the family archive in Rome. But, and this was really very interesting, but we knew that this feature, it's one of the season's pedestals. The statue is not there, that one. And this basin, which is a half an hexagon with this lion head fountain, were there from the beginning. They were certainly there when Andrea Doria finished his garden, meaning that this axis certainly belonged to the original garden, which was a real starting point to elaborate a theoretical model of the main subdivisions of this garden through a grid system using notions that had emerged through the study of late Renaissance gardens. Basically, nearly every garden was, at that time, I'm talking of pre-Mollet and French gardens, and the timing is not exactly the same as in France. For those of you who spoke about Baroque gardens yesterday, there is a slight delay in Italy. But anyway, they were designed on bi-modular grids. And by measuring the dimensions of this basin and measuring the width of this ramp and of this ramp, it turned out that there was a grid transformed into historical units that was basically an alternation of 5 and 8 Genoese palms. It's about 24.8 centimeters. Now, you've got palms everywhere in Italy, or in many places. In every town, there is a slight difference in length. So when you revert from metric into historical measures, you suddenly find out these fantastic numbers, 5 and 8. Now, so this grid model was devised, and of course, when you've got a main axis, you might have a doubling of one of the two modules, because they usually drew this or scratched it with the point of a pointer or compass, and then they did only half. So if the page was to be opened, you might have a doubling at the center. Anyway, it turned out And whoever wants to know more about it, I'll tell him afterwards, because it's a bit complicated, that the main footpath here was to be 12 Genoese palms. These two lateral ones were to be 10, so 5 and 5. This is 12 because it's 8 plus the borders of the frame of this gate. And what turned out to be that the benches that were moved during the Baroque transformation and were now at 7 meters from the fountain should have been at 2.97 meters from the fountain. That means 12 Genoese palms. And in fact, indeed, when we dug in the part that was not bombed, we found a crown, and these are the foundations of the position of the benches. So the benches were eventually put back in their original position, and it turned out quite a sophisticated thing, because the length of the benches around the fountain is exactly the same length as the void between the two benches. So it's a sort of refined play of void and, having an object and then a void and so on of the same length. So here after the discovery of the benches foundations, the Doria Pamphili were convinced that archaeology was indeed an important tool. So they called in, before that I must admit, we sort of dug in a very homey way, only a small depth, but still. And then they called in proper archaeologists, and we found the foundations of the central path that turned to be 12 Genoese path. So everything was confirmed, which was good. And this plan was devised. What do we have here? We have the main axes, which are certainly correspond to the finished Renaissance garden. But of course, the subdivision into compartments, I mean, the pattern of the compartments is made up according to a period comparison. This is a Genoese garden in a late 16th century image, but we've got plenty of other places, and they tend to have the same kind of pattern. And the central one was, the inspiration was from an image that some of you certainly know, because this is taken from Pierre Morin garden in Paris. I've tried to date this very hard, and I've come up with the conclusion that it could be between 1625 and 1640 for certainty. This garden was created by the Morin family of florists in Paris on the site of the Queen Margot palace. And she died in 1605, so it must be after 1605. Now, this is not historical. It's just that this model fitted so well the fountain that it seemed compulsory to adopt it. So we've got the structure that is certainly historical. All the rest is invented, but hopefully sympathetic to the periodization. This has been criticized by many people. So let's go on. This is the construction materials. Palace materials, there are various materials, but certainly a great deal of marble, Carrara marble, which meant that the family was wealthy, because at the time it was very expensive. Then another black stone called cliff black stone that is impossible to get, a wonderful black stone, but the quarries are closed. There are environmental reasons that you can't quarry that stone anymore, not even for conservation. And then a much cheaper but still very much used in Genoa and in this palace, stone that's called ardesia. It's a dark gray black stone with various layers, so you can see the layers. And the foundation of the benches were made of ardesia. So for the edging, marble was used around the fountain as being the most precious position, but all the other edges of the compartments were made of the main, of course, the main subdivisions, because the inner subdivisions were not edged by any hard material. They were made of ardesia. I don't know if you have this word in English. It's a very local material. So this is the construction. Now, what's wrong with this detailing? What's wrong? The wrong part of it is that a lot of concrete was used. My heart sank, but we did not know at the time the technique to build a footpath and at the same time a bed and create a subdivision between them without putting a dry subdivision, just because if you put an edge and there is nothing to hold it, it won't hold. But eventually it emerged because we saw the way the craftsman built the pebble, and what you do is you build timber cases and leave them there so that you can put the edge within it, and then it will rot. Eventually it will rot away, but by the time it rots away, you've got your soil on one side and you've got your footpath on the other side, and there's no problem of pressure, of shifting, etc. So, but we learned that afterwards, that maybe the next garden I'll be able to apply that and to convince them to do that, which is not easy, because the technique is lost. Nobody uses it anymore. They don't know it. And it's time-consuming and it's much more expensive to carry out. Okay, planting. Now, planting. Two things. The pergola, the arbor you see on the back. And the reason we had that arbor was because we found exactly here, we found this, which we thought was the stone case for a pole, and we had found similar ones at the Villa Borghese. We only found one. The measure was exactly 1 palm per 1 palm. So if you put it on the 10-palm footpath on both sides, you would get 12, exactly as the central path. And then you would get, there was a hierarchy in the Renaissance. Main path larger, secondary path smaller, etc., etc. So you would get that effect. However, we found only one, so we think that if there ever was an arbor, it was taken out very soon, before the transformation into a Baroque garden. This was criticized. I can't tell you how much this was criticized by people in Genoa that did not agree with the method. However, the reason that was put in, apart from the archaeological evidence, was that in this palace, very, very similar to the one we are talking about, which belonged to the Doria Pamphili and is in Pelion, a nearby little town, you can see the terrace and the tunnels, the underground tunnels connected through arbors. So, meaning that was, this is an early 18th century image, but in Genoa, every house has got an underground floor, and many have exits from the underground floor into the garden. This is one reason. The other reason is a landscape reason, and this is because for who knows how long, this is the only part that's going to be restored. So you need some sort of visual separation from the parts that are not restored. The third reason is that the owners want the public to enter from here, go underneath the tunnel, emerge in the ticket room where they buy tickets, they can visit the palace, and then come and visit the garden and get out from here. It does not work because this is a dangerous road, so they don't, at the moment, it does not work, but that was their idea. Having decided to put back an arbor, this is one of the numerous tunnels. I mean, there is an underground city here underneath the upper terrace. Having decided to put back a pergola, then we went and seeked for models in Genoese gardens, 16th and early 17th century. This is one of them, but there are others. And they spotted a craftsman who is skilled in the manufacturing of boats. So the technique that was used to bend the timber was taken from boat manufacturing technique. Now, this is the day, September 30th, 2000. This is the Baroque event to open the garden. So we had waterworks, fireworks, and music. And it's lucky it was in the evening because there were so many details in the planting that were wrong that I was very happy they couldn't really see them very well. Anyway, okay. Now, this is the upper terrace. This is the only intervention that was done on the upper terrace, but there is one point that I think is very important, is footpaths. We are basically obsessed with that. I mean, this is a new design. The rhythm of the columns here and the rhythm of the balustrade have basically nothing to do with each other, so we had to invent a way of connecting them. This is made of pietra di finale, finale stone, which is a sedimentary stone with lots of shells in it. It was used in gardens in Genoa. And this is a draining mat made of various layers of draining stones of different size, gradually becoming thinner and thinner, and covered with thinly ground brick and pressed. Well, this held very, very well throughout all the gales and winters and floods we had in Italy this winter. And there was a big discussion about what kind of footpaths you lay down in gardens in Italy, because historically, on many instances, you would put clay, and then it would dry out and become thick and hard, but still be draining. But it's not appealing to anyone today. They don't want to do it. They don't want a bare footpath in a posh garden. And loose gravel is a very, very late invention. So we try to go to not to use that. And there it is. Yes, that's in September. And that's from the other side. Okay. And that's a bit closer. Of course, you had the most precious planting around the fountain, a mixture of roses, herbs, and some herbaceous perennials. Now, a few words on the planting. I've been dealing with planting so much that I now find it it's difficult for me to talk about it. But anyway, the principle was that we would characterize the garden with what plausible planting could have been there at the end of the 16th century. Drawing from what they used to call the coronary plants, meaning basically herbaceous perennials and herbs that were used to produce floral crowns, garlands, festoons, wreaths, etc. By the way, John Evelyn has a chapter called The Coronary Garden, so we're not talking about our heart, we're talking about crowns. To make it more, to clarify this, if you think about cottage garden plants, and you take out those that were introduced in the 19th century, you're very, very close to the type of plants we use there. And in a way, the cottage garden is the sort of popular hair of this kind of planting. Now, we did have scattered information on the specific plants that were used a bit, but not too much. So this is done on general research on this topic. Right? Oh, sorry. You can see Centranthus ruber mixed with roses. By the way, the list of plants is very, very similar to what Jan showed yesterday. Maybe nearly the same, maybe with slight differences for the Hampton Court planting plan. So it's true, I agree that there wasn't a big change from the 17th into the 18th century in plant material. Maybe the way plants were displayed was different, but and some of the proportions, but not really the type of plant. That's a recent photograph. Some topiary, because we know from Schickert's that they had topiary with wooden heads, but we didn't have time to get the timber heads. I didn't want to spend money on. It was a bit complicated. And this is here. Well, they were characterized from plants brought from America, plants brought from the east. This is west. Roses, more precious planting. This is the ascent or descent to the sea, so sea coastal planting. And you've got here Penicetum, and you've got here Dianthus superbus, Armeria. Don't look at this. This is a mistake. It was taken out. These are strawberries. They were put somewhere else. This is Dianthus superbus. Fantastic plant. Flowers all summer. Completely. And this is something that was done on the upper terrace, where they didn't want to spend money, but they wanted to do something. There is a lawn. So we planted an anemone meadow, and by selective cutting, you could get a geometric shape. So you actually can make a parterre, a fake parterre for a month, and have this effect. Okay, I think this is it for Genoa. How are we doing time-wise?
20 minutes. If we give you till 1 o'clock, 20 minutes.
Do you want to hear about the Villa Borghese?
Yes, please.
Okay. I try to do it as quickly as possible. So we. Okay. So we're now in Rome at the Villa Borghese. What you see here on the transparency, which is left to right, this is between 1660s and the 1680s, an image of the overall park. Before this part was transformed into a landscape garden, sort of landscape garden. So we're dealing with this area, basically a terrace, a sequence of terraces east of the main building and west. So 1, 2, 3, and very recently this 4th garden. Now these two images are the only visual evidence we've got of these gardens, that how they, their appearance in the late 17th century, but they were created actually at the beginning of the 17th century. Basically, precise. They were not all created at the same time. Let's start with what the so-called old garden, that means this one, because this garden pre-existed the Borghese acquisition, and here you can see Giardino Segreto, and actually it belonged to this building here. So when they built the palace, they basically destroyed this wall. We found the foundations anyway, and they connected this garden to the palace. Now, the problem with the Villa Borghese was that now it's a public park. It belongs to the town of Rome. When they decided to undertake a restoration, first they thought they would restore the 1920s restoration, which was nearly not there. We'll go back to this. That's what they had. Basically, you only had the fountains and the meadow and a few scattered box hedges left. And, well, that was not a satisfying result. So when I was called to advise, I was a consultant for this, I suggested that instead of reconstructing something, well, first let's try archaeology. But that was very hard because for some unknown reason, one day, people within the administration got a bulldozer, they got into the secret gardens, number 2, 3, and 4, and took 1.5 meters of soil away and just put it out. We managed to save this garden. So that was the only one that underwent archaeological inquiry, but that did not give good results because the soil had been upset so many times. And during the war, it was used as a war kitchen garden to grow potatoes. So basically, archaeology did not help us. It wasn't carried out properly to start with, but still, I think maybe it would have not helped us anyway. So what I suggested was, let's not restore, but let's create a museum of flower gardens. We always had flower gardens on the 3 gardens of different periods. Let's create 3 flower gardens characterized by 3 different periods, and a 4th garden to service the 3, which is what we see here. One, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? Now, this is what we call the old garden. This is, well, the aviary garden, because we've got an aviary here. And this is what we call the sundial garden, because there is a sundial lodge here. And this is what we call the conservation garden, because it's meant to be a propagation garden. This was the idea, and this was indeed what was carried out, with a few things that I am not happy with. In the old garden, for example, the characterization was meant to be late 16th century to early 17th century, but because of that picture that we saw earlier on, which is a Baroque picture, there it is. You see, we've rounded angles, corners, which is, in Italy, you don't find that before 1650. But the Historic Garden Committee said, we have only this image, so we want this to be carried out. I mean, not exactly this design. This was impossible because this garden is 12 meters shorter than the original one. It's cut, it's detached from the building because there is a road that we could not take away. So basically the center has changed so many times that you would never get the same proportions. But they wanted this, and they made me, I had to put them in, although I think it's a mistake. characterized the planting, again, coronary plants, because 16th century it's still herbs and herbaceous. There it is. This design is basically a reflection of this 17th century wall, so it takes up the same rhythm. And there it is. One interesting thing is to renew the discussion about boxwood. In central Italy, well, in warmer climates in Italy, boxwood was regarded in the 16th century and in the 17th century up to a certain moment as a very low status plant because, and that appears recurrently in the treatises, it was thought of as being not nicely scented. They disliked its yes, its odor, and myrtle was the plant to be put in. So we put myrtle. They had 5 varieties in the 17th century. We only have 2 that really work, of Myrtus communis. We put Myrtus communis here. We put Myrtus communis and Myrtus communis tarentina in Genoa. And it turned out, which surprised me, that the tarentina is far more hardier than the common one, the plain one. So this is a lesson learned for the future. And we've got stock gilliflowers and wallflowers and all that sort of planting with herbs. But this was not meant to be only a flower garden. This was meant to be a mixed flower and citrus garden because its design is exactly as a citrus garden. And we know that it started off as a citrus garden and it soon became a mixed form. And we have another example in Italy of a citrus garden exactly with the same design that appears in the engraving, which we should see in one of the slides. Well, I lost it. There it is. This is probably the best Italian garden I know of average size. And that's the Giardino Buonaccorsi at Potenza Picena in the Marcas. And you can see what is the difference between a flower garden and a citrus garden. It's only a difference in emphasis. Oh, sorry, I'm just so afraid of going over time. Well, running out of time, that's why. Okay. Right. Okay. So, Giardino Buonaccorsi at Potenza Picena. Average size, very well maintained, although it probably was constructed in the early 18th century, it maintains 17th century features in various ways. We'll see it later. Now, the difference between a flower garden and a citrus garden, it's a matter of balancing, because in every flower garden you had citrus pots, and in every citrus garden you had flowers as well. So it's a matter of degree. When you see pedestals that are built in and meant to hold pots at this height, I think this is an indication that you are in front of a specialized citrus garden. This is the winter attire. And maybe we can see it better. From the other end, this is the summer attire when the pots are out. I don't know whether you can appreciate it from the slides, but the plan of this terrace is exactly the same plan as in the first engraving I showed you. Okay. And there it is. Now, these pedestals are original. We looked for them all over the place in the Villa Borghese, and we found them sort of thrown away various places, and that was very lucky. Some of them are made of what they call in Italy tufo, which is not tufa, but it's a volcanic porous rock, so they're not very heavy. And this is very unfortunate, because instead of putting stray mats. They put this very modern-looking thing to protect them from winter. They would not accept the suggestion that they should have a proper storing room for the winter because it would take up too much maintenance to shift them from one place to the other. And I think they'll have to buy new citrus plants every other year. Well, coronary garden, you see that. The references in 17th century frescoes in a Roman villa in Frascati, you see. It's basically the coronary tradition is the ideological background for the renewed fashion for flowers. And this is okay. I also tried, but it wasn't very successful, to create a border made of wheat and what they call wheat weeds. That means cornflower, that means poppies, that means gladiolus, etc. But the problem is, with such an undertaking, it was a lot of work and external contractor, that if you give them a package of seeds and say, sow this, they just won't do it. They understand that plant in a pot, but they don't understand this, that it's supposed to be a very easy thing to do. I mean, gardening is not like in this country in Italy. So, they didn't really quite understand what I meant. It was just, sowing the seeds. So it was a bit poor as an effect. And since this happened to me quite a few times, I sort of given up, or the next time I'll do it myself. The other problem we had, detail-wise, is the timing. When do you get the plants? If you get them too soon, and it's always too soon, because they never finish the infrastructure in time, they just don't know how to look after them. So you end up, and also planting may take more than 1 or 2 days if it's such a detailed, finicky planting. So you end up with some overwatered plants, especially the dry, resistant ones you picked to put in a sunny border, but they are standing on the side and have been watered with all the others. And so you get rotted plants, or you get dried out plants. And I think one needs to have real, very good control on the standby position of the plants before they're planted. I don't know whether you had the same problem, those of you who do plant gardens, but I've seen it happening more than once. So this is the second garden. We'll go quickly. And this is my favorite. I think this is the best design, but I shouldn't say this because, of course, I'm not objective. Because it's got the least. Just 1 second. I'm trying to find the second one. Should have been here. Yes, there it is. The second garden is meant to represent the first half of the 17th century garden, so early 17th century garden. I mean, these subdivisions are a bit extreme, brought to an extreme, because the aim is that, is to teach the viewer, and so you have to exaggerate slightly. Of course, distinctions are not so neat. However, what you see on your right-hand side is the initial situation. This is the plan. The idea is to show this progressive tendency to subdivide more the space in order to create space, which is certainly a characteristic of early 17th century flower gardens. So you start up on the right-hand side with a mild subdivision, a very simple one, and proceed to a much more refined and smaller beds. All this design is invented. Of course, the main lines, the main axis is made to match the main architectural features existing there, which means this gate, this is the aviary lodge, and these are fountains attached to the wall. That is, of course, something that we had respect for. Every compartment is framed by what you would call an inner border, in Italian fasce o guide, that means a sort of guiding rails around, which is also a characteristic, later transformed in what you call in France plate-bande. It's the same feature, basically. Okay, let's go on. Yes, initial situation, you see. This is after the cure. Just after the cure, a few months later, yes. This is during construction. Oh, yes, edging again. Now, brick, edge, we knew from the treatises that that was the fashion, that garden beds were edged in Rome in the 17th century. We also found out what the measures were. However, loads of concrete went underneath, and some broke, and there were quite a few accidents with that. I mean, or the workers didn't understand what you wanted, or they didn't understand the drawings. I mean, there were all sorts of things happening. Anyway, this is the first subdivision, and these are these parts. You can see, and further subdivided, but these subdivisions are just inserted bricks. And this is really taken after things that emerged during research. You, David, probably know it by heart by now, but yes. And again, the upper terrace of the Giardino Buonaccorsi in Potenza Picena, you can see the very small, this is really taken after a 17th century design. I mean, these beds are 40 centimeters wide. They're really tiny. And of course, the main planting was meant to be flowering bulbs, and you can see the planting. And of course, we played with patterns, combinations that emerged from documents. And we were lucky because there are quite a few documents from the Roman area of that time. However, I must say that the result was not as expected, because we bought the bulbs in the Netherlands from a company that prides itself of being a heirloom specialized company, buying or reproducing bulbs from the Hortus bulborum in Limmen. But we got very poor quality bulbs, especially the more historical they were, and the poorest the condition was. So there is a big problem with that. I think partly it can be solved, and I agree with Jan. I think hyacinths are the most problematic. However, we adopted this strategy with hyacinths. We managed to get species of Hyacinthus orientalis. And the difference being from modern varieties is that you get less flowers, and it's a lighter flower. And I think that is more similar to what they used in the 17th century. Of course, it's only one type, 3 colors, light blue, dark blue, and white. However, if you had different conditions than in Rome, because they're not very good at maintenance, they're not very good at management, you could probably try to select forms that are similar to 17th century flowers. They would not be the original, but they would be similar. But just like taking up the various painted herbals we've got. You've got plenty of those, even here in London at the Linley Library and so on. Tulips. Well, in a previous job I did 10 years ago, I brought back virus tulips from the North and Wakefield, north of England, Tulip Society. They were fantastic, but they were not looked after, and you only get a few. So what you would need is really proper propagation of that, which you can't get in the Netherlands, because otherwise all their bulb fields are going to get virus, which is going to ruin the economy of. So you can't do it there. You should do it somewhere else where you don't have extensive cultivation of but I think you could get near to what the variety that was a characteristic of 17th century planting. So funnily enough, I must say that the summer, we've got winter and summer planting. The summer planting, which was meant to be really a filling in thing, was more successful than the winter planting. Now, in Italy, one of the things that is different from here, France and the Netherlands, is that the tulip fashion arrived late. And by beginning of the 17th century, you've only got the simple tulip, like Tulipa sylvestris, and the virus one arrived towards the middle to the second half of the 17th century. This is the summer attire. And there it is. And this is entrance to the third garden. Shall we go quickly through that? How are we doing time-wise?
We ought to be coming to an end as soon as we can.
Okay, this is the third garden, between the aviary and the sundial lodge. And this is... Now, the original plan, since we know from documents, there was a flower theatre, basically taking up the entire space of the garden. So you did not have a garden, you had a structure with various steps on both sides, covered with a tent, and you would stroll in the middle and look at the pots with flowers. But we don't have any visual record of that, we've got only documents. So the decision was to put a reduced version here, that means here, and that's it, just to evoke that, which was never put back, and I think it will never be, because something went wrong with the measuring, and this is not, as in this drawing, it's irregular. Well, anyway, whoever is interested, I'll explain the circumstances later. Anyway, in the middle, we put a star, as customary in 17th century gardens, but it's also wind rose, and it relates to the sundial, okay? And also, it relates to documents that testify the presence of central stars in 17th century flower gardens. This is characterized as a late 17th century flower gardens with more mixed planting of bulbs and herbaceous together, a bit like what Jan showed yesterday, whereas in the first half there would be more separation between the two because bulbs were more precious, considered more precious. So instead of putting the flower theatre, they put citrus pots. And a lot of edging, of planting around the edge of the so-called fascia, or if you want, plateband. This is with sweet violet. A lot of work was done to recover all varieties of sweet violet. This is the construction of the central star. And this is the first year flower, and I think the second was much better. And this is, well, of course, breeder. You all know about, because this doesn't work. Breeder, and broken tulip, columbine from the Northern Wakefield Tulip Society, and you can see why. We could talk about it for a long time, but we won't do it now. Why this became so fashionable, because of this metamorphosis from a plain one color to this sort of painted by the brush tulip. And finally, the fourth garden, which only became a garden in the 1920s. There was a conservatory here in the 18th century, and it's completely invented, was meant to be a propagation garden, as you've got one in Potenza Picena on the side, and there it is. Unfortunately, they never managed to really activate it for the purpose it was built, so I don't know what will become of it. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you very much, Ada. Those of you who are in the second year will remember that splendid day in Rome when we went to see Ada's work at the Villa Borghese. I still don't quite understand how the balustrade that's now at Cliveden used to work into Villa Borghese.
I'll show you where the
No.
It's not in the second garden. It's not there.
All right, okay.
It's in front of the palace.
Now, I know that nothing's more dangerous than keeping a conference from its lunch, so I'll be very brief. But a number of people have said, well, what about publication or a book list or something? What we're going to do is ask the speakers to give us a very quick synopsis, 50 words or so, on what they spoke about, with a select book list, a list of key items to go with it. And we'll publish that on a web page. And the web page, this is it. You can't read it from where you are, but there's a number of copies of this on the table outside. Okay, so if any of you are interested in chasing up references from this conference, you will find the web page. Give us a fortnight or so to get the information together and actually publish the page. Right? You'll also find information on the courses here, and of course there's still information on the London Squares Day, which is tomorrow. So thank you very much, Ada, and all the speakers for this morning, and let's have lunch.
I think